Hello, comparative religions, and welcome to the second lesson this week dealing with Egypt and religious belief in Egypt. All right, now we talked a little bit in the first lesson about the history of Egypt. We looked at the pharaohs, okay, and how the pharaohs are worshipped as gods. They are the son of the sun god, okay. We talked about the influence of naturalistic polytheism in Egypt, but how that has morphed into the gods and goddesses. And we looked at the story of Osiris and Isis and Horus as an example of that, and the interconnection of all these gods. So we're moving in this lesson into some more specific religious practices associated with Egypt. And again, I will try to tell you what I want you to copy down as we move through these slides, okay? And I do want you to get down this slide, okay? Egypt is polytheistic. We know that. We also know that the pharaoh is an important figure in society. So one of the pharaohs, all right, was Amenhotep IV. And Amenhotep IV brings a form of monotheism to Egypt. He instituted the worship of only one god, Aton, the sun god, okay, and it was represented by a disk. Amenhotep will change his name to Akhenaten and move his capital essentially kind of into the desert of Egypt. And that's where he will establish this worship of the one god Aton. Now, this brush with monotheism only lasts as long as Akhenaten is alive. Okay, when Akhenaten dies, when Amenhotep dies, the religion is rejected by the surviving Egyptians. His followers kind of disperse, and we return to polytheism. But at one point in time, there was a group of monotheists in Egypt centered on the belief of Akhenaten in one god, the sun god Aton. All right, now I want to show you some religious writings. You do not have to copy these down. Okay, you do not have to copy these down. But here is one of the hymns to Aton from Egypt. Thou dost appear beautiful on the horizon of heaven, O living Aton, thou who wast the first to live. When thou hast risen on the eastern horizon, thou hast filled every land with thy beauty. Thou art fair, great, dazzling, high above every land. Thy rays encompass the lands to the very limit of all thou hast made. So you have this image of this rising sun with all these rays of light coming out, flooding the land with its brilliance. Okay? Here is a passage from Psalms in the Old Testament, Psalm 104. O Lord my God, thou art very great. Thou art clothed with honor and majesty, who coverest thyself with light as with a garment, who hast stretched out the heavens like a tent, who hast laid the beams of thy chambers on the waters, who makest the clouds thy chariot, who ridest on the wings of the wind, who makest the winds thy messengers, fire and flame thy ministers. So even though we don't quite have the same personification of sun here, the God of Psalms, okay, definitely is flooding the world with his light, all right, and is very, very powerful, which is what we see with Aton in Egypt, okay. Now, I'm not saying that the passage in Psalm, came from the hymn of Aton, but we have similar imagery of a single God just being dazzling and enlightening the world with its presence. Okay, that's the similarity between these two writings. Now, moving away from kind of the religion itself, let's talk about religious practices and things like that, religious beliefs in Egypt. Now, we mentioned the pyramids with the pharaoh, okay, and the pyramids are a symbol of power. They're also a symbol of belief in life after death. That is a key concept in Egyptian religious thought: death, heaven, and hell. There is a paradise and there is an underworld. And the best known symbols, and be sure you get this down, the best known symbols of a belief in death and heaven and hell are the pyramids and the presence of mummies. According to the religious beliefs at the time, the dead appear before Osiris, and Osiris has a tribunal, a group of judges, and the dead will confess their sins. And depending on your confession, you will either go to heaven or you will go to the underworld. You'll go to hell. How mummies are prepared, what is going to happen in the afterlife, things like that are written down in the Book of the Dead. Okay? It is a guidebook for the dead. It is a guidebook for preparing the dead, and it is a guidebook for the dead once they enter into the afterlife. In the book, you have magical formulas, including the process for mummification and the steps for mummification. You have hymns that are to be sung and prayers that are to be recited over the dead. You also have these stories like Osiris and Isis and Horus, and the story of the tribunal where you have to confess your sins and things like that. Those mythology are also included in the Book of the Dead. So this is one of the examples in Egypt of a religious text. All right, because of the strong belief in death, heaven, and hell, the Book of the Dead is a very, very important religious text in Egypt. Now, the mummies are placed in pyramids, and we talked about the pyramids with the pharaohs. Like I said, the pyramids are going to include everything that you need to speed your journey and ease your transition into the afterlife. Okay, and especially this belief that you are going to continue and you're going to be reunited with those that have passed before. Okay, so you want to be sure you have all the stuff you need in order to carry on your existence in the afterlife. Okay, and then you want to be sure that you confess your deeds and you end up going to heaven and not hell. All right, so strong emphasis on death, heaven, and hell in Egyptian culture. Now, besides the pyramids, there are other examples of religious architecture in Egypt. Okay, we have found the remains of temples. Of course, one of the big religious icons in Egypt is the Sphinx. All right, and we know the big Sphinx, but there are also smaller Sphinxes around, and of course, pyramids. All activity is going to revolve around the temple. And from written records and from archaeological evidence, there is a hierarchy of priests, scribes, purifiers, etc., who perform various religious tasks. And we have found the remains of, in the temple, of different rooms that this hierarchy is going to be associated with. So there's rooms for the priests, there's room for the scribes, etc., etc. Ceremonies are conducted daily. We have seen this before in polytheistic societies. We're going to talk about it again when we get to Greece and Rome. But you've got a lot of gods out there, and the gods are controlling these cosmic forces and these nature forces. You're going to have to appease them daily. Okay, especially in an area like Egypt, we talked about the importance of the Nile and the Nile flooding to provide enough water to raise vegetation around the banks of the Nile. That's tied to the gods and goddesses as well. So ceremonies are conducted daily. You've got the pharaoh up at the top, and then underneath it are these hierarchy of priests, scribes, purifiers, etc. We've talked once again the pyramids. The pyramids are going to represent royal power. They're also going to be burial chambers. The Sphinx is another example of royal power. Okay, because the Sphinx is a combination of the head of the ruler or pharaoh with the body of a lion. All right, and we in nature, oftentimes the lion is referred to as the king of the jungle. So even the presence of this animal half of the pharaoh's body is important. It represents power. Okay, you have Pharaoh, who is the king, who is the ruler of Egypt. His head is on the body of the lion. The lion is seen as the king of the jungle. Okay, so within these important religious buildings, not only is it tied to the religious practices, but it's also tied to the power within Egyptian society. You've got the pharaoh at the top and this hierarchy below him of different religious officials. Okay, and be sure you got that slide down as well. We talked about the animal cults, the numerous deities that are in Egyptian religion. We've talked about the presence of the temples and things like that. So it should come as no surprise that there are a lot of occult practices within Egypt. Okay? There were charms, there were curses, there were threats. And the best example of this is those curses that supposedly protect the pyramids. Okay? And they are leveled against anyone who would violate the sanctity of the pyramids. All right. Now, that's connected to this idea of life after death. But when the Pharaoh was alive and the Pharaoh was making decrees and was establishing justice and handing out justice, there were curses and threats and things like that tied to that as well. Okay. If you violated one of the Pharaoh's decrees or you defamed him in some way, you were going to be punished. All right. And chances are, not only would you be punished in this life, but you would probably be punished in the next life as well. Okay? Because remember, the Pharaoh is the son of the sun god and is a god himself. Now, on the outside of one of the officials' tombs, here's one of these curses that we have found. The crocodile be against him in the water, the snake be against him on land, against him who may do a thing to this tomb. Okay? So if you break into this tomb, crocodiles are going to chase you in water, snakes are going to chase you in land because you've defiled this sacred place. And again, it's not surprising that we see practices like this. Number one, because we have so many gods and goddesses, and they are in control of these cosmic forces, these nature forces. We talk about in the last slide that religious practices occur on a daily basis. So it's not surprising that these magical elements are going to be seen in society. Okay. And we've also talked about the importance of life after death. So it's not surprising we're going to see these occult practices there as well to protect the dead as they move on to the afterlife. And these practices are going to vary because, once again, we have so many gods and goddesses and we have all those different animal combinations and things like that. There are going to be specific rituals tied to each specific god and goddess. So these occult practices very, very important in Egypt. All right. Now, believe it or not, that is it for Egypt. Okay. Like I said in the last presentation, no specific assessment on just Egypt, but this material will be on a larger assessment dealing with our polytheistic societies, Greece, Rome, and of course, Egypt.